Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us. It's really great to see so many people of you here for our webinar. This is part of our EdgeNet Green Dreams in Peripheral Development series. And we're Joanie Willett from the University of Exeter and Madeliene Eriksson of Umea University, and we're two of the co-conveners of EdgeNet. EdgeNet is a regional studies association research network, and we bring together scholars and policy practitioners to talk about economic development in peripheral regions, hence the edge in our name, because we're interested in regions that quite literally are imagined to be on the edge of the body politic, or perhaps even outside of what's sometimes considered to be economically useful parts of our political and economic communities. So this webinar marks a new theme on what we've been looking at. For a few years, we've noticed how some of the peripheries that we've been researching have started to become securitized, or in other words, have gone from being largely overlooked or kind of under thought about to being considered as being important in some way for their contribution to national security. And this is really new, or it feels really new to us, but maybe you'll have a different view, in which case that would be really interesting to hear your thoughts too. So this isn't a theme that we've noticed very much in regional studies, but it is something that's been emerging over maybe about the past 5 or 6 years. Predating Ukraine, but only by a few years, we think. So at the heart of this is resource extraction, and much of the stuff that makes up the things that we use, including the technologies that we're using to communicate today, is made from materials that were either grown or mined in peripheral regions. In some of the examples that we're going to talk to you about today, these regions produce minerals that are even considered to be critical, particularly to energy transition from fossil fuels to cleaner forms of energy. And we're wondering in this webinar whether the current geopolitical climate, whether this might end up, we might end up seeing such peripheries actually becoming de-peripheralised. Do critical minerals offer the opportunities for some regions to become economically less peripheral? So we're going to be looking at this through 3 fascinating case studies: Northern Sweden, South Australia, and Cornwall in the southwest of the UK. And we've got some really super speakers as part of our webinar. So there's 6 of us. So what we're going to do is we're going to open with a very brief overview of our topic area before having a discussion together as a whole group. And then we'll go to questions from all of you. So I'm sure that you all know the drill by now, but this session is being recorded right up to the audience questions. Please keep yourselves on mute. It's also always lovely if you have your cameras on, because it's really helpful for us. But please keep your volume on mute, and feel free to use the chat to put in your questions and thoughts over the course of our discussion, or even just to have a conversation amongst you all. It can be quite a nice thing to do as well. If you've got a specific question for any of us, then when you post it in the chat, if you put a nice big Q at the start of your comment, and then we'll know that's something that we want to put to all of us panelists over the in the question and answer session. Okay, so a little bit of introductions and running order. We're going to start with Harry Pitts from the University of Exeter, who's going to look at geopolitics and securitisation as a set of ideas. Then we're going to move to Madeliene Eriksson, who's going to give us some examples about new meanings of security and resources in northern Sweden as part of the EU and also part of the Arctic. Rainnie from the University of Melbourne is going to introduce South Australia and security. And then Darryn Snell, also from the University of Melbourne, is going to talk about work and regional regeneration in South Australia. And then myself, I'm Joanie Willett from the University of Exeter. I'm going to talk about Securitisation and Cornish Imaginaries. So thanks very much, everybody. And Harry, over to you for some geopolitical context.
Thank you, Joanie, and morning, everybody, or may not be morning where you are, but I'll say mornings this morning here. So I'm Harry Pitts. I'm a Associate Professor of Political Economy and the Future of Work, and the Head of Humanities and Social Sciences at University of Exeter's campus in Cornwall, which is in my hometown here of Penryn. And I'm also Deputy Director of the Centre for the Public Understanding of Defence and Security at the university as well. So I've got the brief of talking about geopolitics and securitisation. I'm going to try to do that under 6 words beginning with P, because my name's Pitts and I'm a political economist. The first one is power. So I think power has shifted in the world, as we've seen in a lot of the really interesting contributions in the academic debate recently about concepts like the Second Cold War, or World Civil War, as I would call it. Power has become about control over networks, infrastructures, and overlaid with the political fragmentation of the global liberal order. We've also seen Russian aggression in Europe, Chinese and US competition over those networks and infrastructures kind of give a completely new geopolitical order of things compared to the so-called kind of end of history period post 1989, and this is centered on physical resources. The second P, as Joanie's already mentioned, as we've seen in the news recently, it's not just physical resources, but it's also physical products. It's physical infrastructures. It's physical networks that have to be located somewhere rather than anywhere. And this is seen in some countries a shift, such as in the UK, away from that kind of service-driven growth model, or an attempted shift anyway, in recognition of the centrality of those physical resources to power. Now, I think this is where concepts of peripheralisation and peripheries are new to me as a political economist. I mean, I've only really been thinking about them, learning from Joanie, having moved back home to where I'm from in Cornwall, and really thinking about those categories. But I do think that, you know, place has been totally reconfigured by this, and we can see that in our own neck of the woods, as we'll explore later. Because those physical resources are always located somewhere rather than anywhere, this does create a different kind of geographic imaginary of what islands like the UK consist of. What is strategic? Where is their sovereign capability? How do geographies serve the purposes of defence and security, for instance, are all kind of different ways of looking at what's out there on our doorsteps. Production is the other P, next P, in the sense that supply chains have become a centre point of thinking about resilience, societal resilience, the ability to keep everyday life going in the event of a conflict, let's say, which is a big talking point at the moment. In the UK, this has led to calls for reindustrialisation, the return of industrial policy and industrial strategy, all framed under that kind of geopolitical rationale of needing to securitise inputs and outputs. I think the people point is really key here. So people is my 5th P. It requires different skills, different jobs, different makeup of how people earn their livelihoods. And it could be quite an adjustment for some places. It's also an opportunity for others as well. And I've framed that under the concept of workplace geopolitics, which Al and Darryn have written some contributions on as well. How does that geopolitical context give different forms of bargaining power or leverage to different groups of workers in different industries, and the kind of speculative futures we might build up about the future of work from that? And finally, my final P is protection, because I think there's also economic protection inherent within that. There's also the sense of vulnerability that comes from this emerging age of unpeace, as Mark Leonard calls it. It's in some cases the war is hot, but in other cases the war is cold. Those vulnerabilities, or the perception of those vulnerabilities, proliferates and increases or includes an ever wider array of different social, economic, cultural and political moments within a logic of securitisation under the kind of banner of whole of society security and defence. I think those vulnerabilities with those forms of connection that come from infrastructures, networks, supply chains, mean that that logic of securitisation cuts through everyday life in a way that isn't just about competing blocks or competing countries, but these divides and tensions run right through society itself, domestically, nationally, but also crucially locally as well. Something we'll explore more in the discussion. I think that is 5 minutes, Jodie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's super. Okay. So next on our list, I think we've got Madeliene.
Yes, morning everyone. Really nice to be here. I'm an associate professor in human geography here in Sweden, in northern Sweden, Umea University. And I've mostly been doing work on social costs of the green transition, looking a lot on documents, interview studies, and so forth. So this is very new to me. It's because of Joanie. So I've started being very intrigued. But also, of course, it's kind of a natural step for me to start and studying the security discourse in Sweden. And yes, so I'm going to start and talk about Sweden and northern Sweden particularly. And just a little bit about a context. So when it comes to Sweden, we have this historic break in 2024 when Sweden joined NATO. So it's a historic break from neutrality in Sweden, something that's very much formed our identity for 200 years. We saw ourselves as being this alliance-free in peace, aiming for neutrality in war. But of course, a big motivation to become part of NATO was Russia's invasion of Ukraine and our very close proximity to Russia. So with this, we have more than doubled our budget for military and defense. So this is a big shift. And this has also, so when I'm looking at on discourses of green transition, extraction, and so forth, I mean, it's very obvious that the kind of wider security mindset in domestic policy has been kind of sped up in a sense. So energy systems, critical minerals are now discussed in a different way, more in the context of vulnerability, national resilience, and so forth. And of course, so the effects are very strong, very visible here in the Arctic, in northern Sweden, where the green transition that's been, in a sense, the so-called green transition has been in effect for a couple of years, but now it overlaps with new defense and industrial priorities to a very high extent. And only a few years ago, when I started to looking at the green transition and all these really big mega giga investments going into the Swedish North, Sweden, we mainly talked about the sustainability-led growth, the goals of net zero, and so on. But now in both EU and Swedish documents, we see this, that the access to critical minerals is described as essential for resilience and competitiveness in Europe, and increasingly so for security in Europe. So as a result, we see in the discourse that northern Sweden and the Arctic is recast as this mineral frontier of EU. So in that sense, the northern Sweden region is no longer only seen as peripheral, but also as very strategically kind of indispensable for the bigger EU context. And our previous research shows very much that Sweden already have, with these stories of extraction for the wealth of the nation, the extraction has very much been normalized in northern Sweden with big investments in industries and mines. But the security framing narrows this policy space even more. But what is not very much talked about is the everyday social lives in these regions, the labor conditions, and so on. And it's very much pushed to the edges. So northern Sweden has these very strategic assets, as I said before, hydropower, wind, iron ore, rare earths, and so on, central to these kind of EU stories, yes. But northern Sweden is also, we have these long-standing questions about spatial justice and Sami rights in the north. We have this population decrease, we have stretched welfare services, and so on. So the shift is very, very dramatic in Sweden, I would say. And I also want to contrast with the present, with the political discussions from the early 80s about our common security, where we have this common security was the name of this doctrine that was developed by the Independent Commission of Disarmament and Security Issues, chaired by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. So according to him and the Commission, they argue that security comes from cooperation, dialogue, restraint, and reducing weapons. And this was during the Cold War, when the world was dominated by fear and nuclear war. But this is not as much talked about today. So yes, thank you, Joanie. Yes, so we stop there, and I will pass on to Rainnie from University of Melbourne.
Thank you. Yes, I am Rainnie. I'm not from the University of Melbourne. Melbourne University would have a fit if they thought I was being associated with them. I'm actually from the newly constituted Adelaide University, which is actually in South Australia. I'm an adjunct professor, which just simply means I'm old and they don't pay me anymore. What I want to talk about is a lot of the themes that Darryn, myself, and our colleague Mark Dean covered in a book that we had published a couple of months ago called Australia's Regional Industrial Future. In that, we looked at the impact that the Cold War, a lot of things that Madeliene was talking about, that the Cold War, COVID, stagnation, and the environmental crisis had its implications for regions, and particularly for renewables, for renewable energy, and so on. We also looked at another tendency which has been developing for a long time now, which is the militarization of Australian industrial policy. That got massively accelerated by the poly crisis. At the same time, we were also seeing analysis of the re-emergence of the region into industrial policy, Alami's notion of the new state capitalism, for example, Mariana Mazzucato's notion of the environmental state. So briefly, there appeared to be a window opening, which was fairly optimistic, which gave a more positive and progressive vision of what industrial policy and regional policy might be. I think it was very, very quickly shut down for some of the reasons that Madeliene went into. But here, Darryn and I have looked at the way that the notion of just transition, very powerful to start off with, in recent years has been depoliticized and now means at regional level very little more than a very old jobs and growth model. We wrote the book and published the book before, sadly, Trump 2.0 appeared. And that does have a massive accelerating effect, concentrating effect on all the tendencies that we talked about in that book. The end of the convenient fiction of the rules-bound order, never mind the Washington consensus, the general agreement now that there's no going back, means that the whole question of regional development, and particularly the notion of securonomics, of military as defence industries, as regional policy in South Australia is becoming very problematic, because in South Australia, we're the bit right in the middle that no one ever talks about. But we were a home of the motor industry for many years. That died about 20 years ago. When AUKUS, and for those of you who don't know what AUKUS is, it's the agreement about the construction of nuclear submarines between the United States, the UK, and Australia. It's costing Australia $368 billion. The submarines were supposed to be built just up the road here in South Australia. We were promised it would create thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. It would replace all the jobs that had disappeared when the motor industry went. This is what the Prime Minister told us. It is nonsense. It is not going to happen, and it's more and more generally accepted that it's not going to happen. The other part of the issue around the whole question of critical minerals, which is the other thing that people have talked about, is that critical minerals in South Australia means copper. And copper effectively means a huge development in the middle of the far north of South Australia, miles and miles. And it's a 5-hour drive from here, called Olympic Dam, which is a huge BHP operation, which is one of the biggest single contributors to greenhouse gases in Australia, and a huge demand on water resources as well. It is far from being an unalloyed advantage, if you'll pardon the pun. The other problem with AUKUS is there are two pillars. One pillar is the nuclear submarines. The other pillar is the technical thing, the whole surveillance, monitoring, high tech, cementing Australia into the new technology military complex. And that, in that sense, regionally, it's being witnessed now by a massive competition by Australian regions to get data centres. This is the new method of growth. They're collapsing planning regulations to attract data centres in now. There's all sorts of problems with data centres that I'm not going to go into, but it's a classic demonstration of where everything that was previously thought positive in regional development has now shrunk back to jobs and growth and very little else. Two more points, and I promise I'll shut up. The first point is that Australia finds itself in a very difficult position in all this, because on one hand, we are going hand in hand with America. And I could go on about that, but I won't. But the biggest single market for practically everything that Australia produces is China. So Australia is Janus-faced. It faces two ways at any one point and is caught in that trap. The second thing is the opportunity cost of AUKUS and everything else. It's not what we are investing in, it's what we're not investing in, because we're spending so much. In this state, we have got the highest concentration of rooftop panels and batteries of any state in Australia. We are nearly self-reliant. We have no recycling facilities at all for rooftop panels. It is not part of the industrial strategy of this government to make it a central element. There is nothing nationally on this. Well, sorry, a new pilot project was announced last week, but nothing on that. We've got nothing on recycling. We're not meeting our targets on renewables. We've got a housing crisis like you wouldn't believe, but it's going to take, if we get the data centers that we're being threatened with, and we've put in for 240 of them, it will take up every single construction worker that this country possesses to build them. So it's only going to compound the problems. So, and at that point, Darren's going to talk in more detail about some of these things. I'll shut up now and hand over to Darryn.
Thanks, Al. Good morning, everyone. So thank you for attending this session. Just a little bit, my background, I'm an associate professor in the School of Management at RMIT University, which is in Melbourne. My research for a long time has really been around net zero impacts on transitioning regions and how regions make that adjustment, in particular carbon exposed regions. And the ways in which the job question, so Harry's P being people, is really the area in which I spend much of my work. And I suppose this question of green dreams, and as Al has hinted at, some of these green dreams have turned into false promises. And I suppose what I want to talk about here is the ways in which regions confront those dilemmas, particularly regions that are either can be described as left behind or potentially headed down that path of being left behind, particularly fossil fuel dependent regions who are now looking at an uncertain future. and the promises associated with that. And as Al pointed out, one of the things that we look at in that book is the tensions between militarization on one hand and green capitalism on the other, and the promises that are made to regions, particularly around jobs, whether it's renewable energy and the bonanza of jobs that will be created with solar farms and onshore and offshore wind and battery storage and even hydrogen. And this isn't an uncommon story for Europe and North America as well. Unfortunately, much of that work is in the construction stage and not a lot of ongoing jobs. And so there's significant concerns about, as Al points out quite rightly, there's a lot of construction work that's going to be associated with many of this, data centers being the latest one as well. The question of militarization and defense related industry for regions has been also that sort of promise of regional revitalization in various parts of Australia, particularly South Australia, along with critical minerals in remote areas. And at one point, critical minerals in Australia were promoted on the basis of their green credentials, that this was going to help in the net zero transition and so on. Increasingly now, it's full-blown militarized and associated with AUKUS. So it's interesting how that dynamic has changed. The question around securitization and minerals, I think, opens up some serious dilemmas for regions, and questions in relation to what sort of projects should be supported. Which is going to deliver jobs and decent jobs? Are we talking ongoing jobs? Are we talking jobs that are aligned with the traditional skills located in the area? Are we talking about something fundamentally different? Data centers, as Al has hinted at, is become now the latest wave of promises to regions for revitalization. It's being fast-tracked. And associated with that, I think we need to think about water as being a similar resource along with critical minerals. And these data centers, I don't think we can dismiss their connection to securitization and militarization and important questions around that. And there's no doubt that for regions, and one of the regions that I have spent a lot of time working in, where coal-fired power plants are being shut down and pit lakes are being promised, data centers are now becoming very interested in the opportunities to source the water from these pit lakes, which used to be coal mines. And the question then for regions who are desperate for jobs and desperate for regional revitalization, what will a data center mean for them? And then my final point is around the voice of local communities, particularly in relation to securitization. To what degree, when much of these decisions are nationally driven, resources are prioritized, and resources are geographically located, water, critical minerals, and so on. What will be the voice of local communities in relation to some of these projects? The issue of AUKUS and Australia's alliance to the United States means that the US is certainly moving around at the moment, looking at all sorts of sites for critical mineral development. the question of what voice local communities have in this process, I think, open up some real dilemmas for regions. So those are trying to make some of the connections to the other presentations, and I will turn it back over to you, Joanie.
Thanks so much for that, Darryn. That's great. Okay, so my name's Joanie Willett, and I'm an associate professor in regional development and governance with the University of Exeter. And for a large chunk of my career, I've been looking at the way that peripheries are imagined and the impact that that has on peripheral economies and communities. So today I'm going to talk about securitization and Cornish imaginaries. And it's interesting that Madeliene was saying about the way that northern Sweden has, Sweden has gone from being sort of green transition, just transition towards kind of securitization kinds of discourses, because we've had a similar kind of a massive about face in Cornwall as well. So if you were to do a word cloud association about the way that people imagine Cornwall, you'd get something along the lines of beautiful beaches, sunshine, surfing, so very dominated by the leisure industry. But in the past 5 or 6 years, something very different has been added, and that's the idea of Cornwall as being important to UK national security. So if you run a LexisNexis newspaper database search around Cornwall insecurity, you find something really interesting has happened. So if we go right the way back to 1982, so decades ago, in the old days of the Cold War, the potential for geothermal energy in Cornwall was discussed about as being an insurance policy for energy self-sufficiency for the UK, but certainly wasn't talked about in any way around sort of security or securitization. If we wind forward a couple of decades to the early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion then around food security, and Cornwall as a food producer was very much a part of this discourse. So, for example, between 1978 and 2017, there were over 10,000 references to food and security in Cornwall. But since 2022, there's been a year-on-year decline. So that kind of securitization has been declining. But at the same time, while food security as an issue is talked about less, another kind of security and securitization is amping up, and this speaks very much to the geopolitical questions that we've been talking about earlier. On the 21st of January 2021, for example, Alexander Stafford writing in the Times newspaper, starts talking about the possibilities of lithium mining alongside Cornwall's traditional tin. And he goes, unsurprisingly, the appetite for critical minerals has rocketed, creating concerns about our energy security that go to the heart of national security. Later on, he talks about how it's no exaggeration to say that Britain finds itself in the middle of a new geopolitical game. So this is really contextualizing the new securitization of Cornwall in terms of the wider geopolitical questions that are being asked, including contextualized in terms of the dominance of China and with regards to global rare earth commodities. And it must have hit a zeitgeist, because in 2023 we see another massive leap in the number of references, and this is all around kind of like the Ukrainian war, etc. And from there on, there's been a steady upward trajectory. What's really interesting more recently is that in the summer of 2025, for example, there's been a significant amount of activity in trying to encourage government investment on the basis of critical minerals. So political leaders in Cornwall, including our members of parliament, have been making the argument, or trying to make the argument, to say that Cornwall needs more investment because of the contribution that it can make to the UK's energy security, or the UK's security in terms of floating offshore wind, critical minerals, and industrial dependence. What we also see at this particular point in time is that the UK industrial strategy more generally is, adding mining and minerals back to being of strategic importance, whereas for several decades most of the focus has been around the service industry and the importance of the service industry. So what's really fascinating is that, as well as being known as a visitor region, what is being developed now is a discourse around Cornwall that says Cornwall is vital for UK national security because of all of these things that can be found here. Thank you very much. And over to Madeliene now, and we're going to run our panel discussion, where we get to sort of chat around these kind of questions. Madeliene, over to you.
Yes. So the idea now is to pass the word around a bit, and I have some questions to the panelists here, the speakers. And of course, there's a lot of different concepts going around here as well that I would like that you kind of try and talk about and define. But I'm thinking about starting up very broadly, and of course, there's no lack of energy here among the speakers, so I know that you can answer most of my questions. But I would try and pose this question, perhaps starting with Al. In the case of, you've been studying Southern Australia for a while now, but what kind of new security issues or shifts in security thinking is happening right now, or do you find most important to research on right now? So what is the most crucial shift in securitization?
It's a very good question. I think two things. The first is that I would be lying if I said that any of the major political parties were questioning either AUKUS or Australia's role in AUKUS. However, there is, at a growing level, particularly within South Australia at a community level, a growing question of whether we should be in AUKUS or not, whether Australia should be in AUKUS or not. And that then raises much, much wider questions of, if we do withdraw from AUKUS, and there are demands for that, then what would a defence policy look like that had Australia outside of AUKUS? Now, that's way more than we're going to discuss today, but all I'm pointing out is that that is one question that's on the agenda. In fact, I'm addressing a public meeting in Adelaide next week on this very subject. There is a discussion going on about that. The other thing I think is that there is beginning to be a question, feeling this, that the whole collapsing of the whole regional development issue down to simply jobs and growth and security is causing us problems. For example, one of the other implications of AUKUS was that our possibilities of developing a site on the west coast of Australia to decommission all the offshore oil and gas, then there's millions and millions of tons of it off the northwest shelf, which would provide all the scrap steel, which could have potentially saved a steelworks in South Australia, which is being threatened at the moment, was blown out of the water because the site for the decommissioning was given to AUKUS. So people are beginning to see that it's not just a question of AUKUS and security, it's a question of these questions are linked up with all sorts of other issues, and it's becoming a lot more complex. But it's becoming a lot more complex, but it's becoming debated in a way that 5 years ago it wasn't.
Yeah, I also find it's a bit disturbing how this green transition and militarization is so merged together. I don't know, Harry, do you have any comment on that? I mean, how can we separate the the green transition, the will of a green industrialization, and also the increased extraction of minerals in the UK, for instance. Is it possible to separate these two things?
I don't think so. And I guess I would read, just looking at the questions in the chat there from Tim. I think that the trend towards militarization and then the securitization of various different industries, I don't think it's just a kind of discursive or ideological maneuver, but it reflects real material tendencies and real material threats. So if I think about the context of the UK, there are fundamental vulnerabilities which are today expressed in cyber attack, attempted sabotage of critical infrastructure, but on some scenarios which could play out in a conventional attack in some conflict scenario within Europe, based on Russia's aggression, that there is a need to be able to prepare for. And I don't think that can be wished away. There's also the issue around hard power and the US kind of position in the world, which is increasingly using its own hard power to extract concessions and a kind of laissez-faire attitude to be able to do whatever it wants anywhere, which it's also incumbent upon middle powers and European countries particular to think about their own capacity to be able to build up the ability to defend themselves in various ways, which means that it's not possible to really delay or wish away those tendencies towards militarization and securitization. There's an as there is with the green transition, which answers the existential imperative of combating climate collapse. There are other existential imperatives that drive broader processes of militarization, which I guess I'm possibly less critical of than some other people in the room and some other scholarship, and I can see a justification for some of those steps, partly because they provide a response to a world where all the hard power is weighted on the side of those whose interests are fundamentally not in the protection of liberal democracy. So it's a complicated and contradictory set of circumstances, but you have to keep open the possibility that sustainability is preserved as a mission by being carried within a broader prerogative of security, rather than being neutralized and set to one side as if it doesn't really matter. Because I think this is all about being able to protect human life and be able to protect liberal societies.
So, Joanie, do you want to respond or comment on this?
I think one of the things that I was just reading through Tim Hughes's comment here about biodiversity and security, and I think this is one of the things that I really wanted to kind of really highlight is that I wonder to what degree a lot of these things become fabricated a little bit. So, just for example, at what point, why is military security more important than food security? Or why is military security, why does that trump nature depletion, which, with the UK is one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. If we don't have enough biodiversity, we're not going to be able to feed ourselves, but somehow it's interesting the way that some types of security automatically, override others that might be more crucial in terms of, I don't know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something.
Darryn?
Look, I want to respond to the question there about how's it received in regional communities and link it to the question of food security as well. I mean, in particular, the question of water, for example, we're going to see significant if you like, wars in relation to water. And I think the question of, in regional communities, even with a data center, and I'm expecting this to appear across many communities in Australia, which is a dry continent, but yet we want data centers. We want to be the center or the hub for building this so-called smart infrastructure is what is being presented. And there's no discussion at the moment with farmers about who's going to use that water, how is it going to be allocated, what are the implications for the aquifers, and so on. And all of those national decisions and initiatives and priorities around securitization and so on, communities are second order in terms of the discussion, and they are very, I think I would agree with this, there's multiple different perspectives in terms of how it's being received within regional communities, whether it's an offshore wind project, which are controversial. Transmission lines have been controversial. Defense factories, data centers. But my point around, regions that are desperate for jobs, you do see situations where, we'll take a waste to energy plant if that means that we're going to have some ongoing employment. So I think they are really difficult questions, but it's also how and at what point regional communities get their voice, and get organized and develop solidarity, often to fight these projects. And I think we will see more of that.
I think one of the problems, to develop the point that Darryn's just made, one of the problems is that a lot of the policies are bringing in either regional development or military industries or call centers, data centers, whatever, are all top down. We've had a lot of rhetoric about place-based policy in recent years. Frankly, a lot of it is simply cosmetic. It means that people fly in, talk to a few people who look suspiciously like they do, fly out again and say that the consultation process has taken place. To give you another example, the community where the steelworks is trying to get a green steel process and losing at the moment went through a massive community consultation process. Absolutely. It was one of the most fundamental community consultation processes I have ever seen in my life. And in the process of trying to work out what's been going to happen to the steel industry, absolutely no notice has been taken of it at all. That is my worry at the moment. And one quick point about the stuff that Harry said about is it an either or with defence or the green stuff. A point to bear in mind is that the defence industries are one of the largest single defence industries organisations' activities are one of the largest single contributors to the greenhouse problem on the planet. If the Americans, Europe and Australia, as well as the Russians and whatever, increase their military expenditure as they are planning to do, there is no chance whatsoever that we will be able to restrict heating below the 1.5 degrees above the norm that we've been aiming at, and very little chance we'll be able to keep it below 2. It's not an either or.
Thank you, Al. No, I'm just trying to stay with the local regions and how the kind of security discourse and the materiality of securitization is played out in the local areas. And I have one example from my region with this bright, shiny battery factory that was built here a couple of years ago, and the bankruptcy, and now this huge gigafactory is bought up by an American company, Lighten, which is a company that produces batteries for drones mainly for the US defense industry. So I think, doesn't it matter for local regions of what kind of industries, so why are mines opening, for instance? Is it because of the green transition? Is it because of the increased threat from the US? So does it matter for people? And I'm also thinking about the indigenous population in the northern Sweden, the Arctic as well. I think that a lot of them saw the green transition, a green potential industrialization as something hopeful and something that they could kind of, okay, we can have a dialogue around new wind power because of this. But I'm not sure if the threat or the militarization has the same impact. And I don't know how the discussions are going in Australia, or if it's a similar discussion going on in the UK at all.
It is similar in Australia, and certainly the issue of net zero, renewable energy transition, and the promise to regional Australia was also a promise for First Nation peoples, that there were going to be opportunities, because where these solar farms would be located would be in regional and remote areas. Same with wind farms and so on. And the promise, I suppose, was that this time will be different. It won't be like mines that, you know, displaced people and so on. And there will be opportunities both for employment, but also for entrepreneurial engagement in some of these projects. So there are certainly similarities there. And look, there's been some success stories, good news stories, I suppose, in some ways around some of these projects, but certainly lots more work to be done in that space for sure.
If I could can just jump in, I'm finding it really fascinating about the way that kind of linguistically there's this slide that goes that links the geopolitical imperative. So for the material or for the materials that are needed in order for different places to be able to make stuff. So, you know, the UK economy, for example, you know, part of the reason why the West wants to make sure that it's got access to, for example, lithium or lithium batteries is because it wants to make sure that it can make the things that it wants to make without any impediment of somebody else saying, by the way, you can't have this stuff that you need. And then, you know, so that's kind of like, that's an economic kind of imperative. And then this then becomes, you know, made into an issue of military security that and it is also fascinating to me the way that additional pulling power of military security then means that our communities, which might have been underinvested for years. I mean, I find it really fascinating the way that Cornwall seems to matter now. It's like, didn't Cornwall matter before? You know, and you know, what does that mean for that? What does that mean for peripheries? Does that mean that the Arctic is actually going to matter? Does it mean that people in Arctic communities or South Australian communities or Cornwall's communities are going to matter more now? Or is it still a question about where the place and the people become sort of detached, and we end up becoming a bit of a kind of like a bit of a game of Catan almost, forgetting that actually we're talking about real people's lives on a day-to-day level?
Yes, Harry.
Yeah, I think they're really good points. And I think it also works both ways, in that at least some of the polling that's done on UK public opinion about people's views on investment in net zero and investment in defence, let's say, it's not clear. It seems to me some of that evidence, which I was just trying to look for but can't dig out, but for instance, YouGov polling on them shows a high degree of skepticism about claims around net zero among the public, rightly or wrongly, whereas there's a greater degree of support about investment in defence. So if you let's take in Cornish terms, there is disruption attached with the critical minerals revival in certain places, but it's interesting to it's more of a question really for us to look into rather than an answer, but how people's propensity to feel positive towards those kinds of developments, how that then is linked to greater or lesser skepticism about net zero versus defence as prerogatives for that type of reindustrialisation. And it's by no means clear cut that people would support that on the basis of sustainability more than they would on a logic of national security. And I'm sure that this is something industries are attuned to as well in terms of how they make their pitch for what they're doing and gain social license around it. There's all kinds of complicated reasons for why people would support one or the other. And I think one of the fundamental reasons here in talking about the intertwining of industrial development with defence, for instance, is what people feel they're defending, right? I mean, these kind of fundamental political and social questions about what people see themselves as defending and securing. And that's, of course, a topic of great antagonism and contestation over what is the society in the whole of society approach to defence and security, which is, I don't think, clear cut, and something obviously there's more work to be done on.
Yes, I think that we need to wrap up this panel. I just want to end with linking to your commentary about, what is it supposed to be secured? Who's supposed to be secure from what? In Sweden now, Greta Thunberg is perceived as a national threat. And I think that's very telling how the discourse has changed very, very rapidly in Sweden towards a more security discourse, definitely, from being this proud of the nation, Greta Thunberg, to becoming a threat to the nation. And that also kind of begs the question, what is she a threat of then? What is it we need to kind of be secured of?
Okay, so thank you ever such a lot for that, everybody. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I just want literally a 20-second thought bubble from some of our speakers. If you want, who wants to jump in? Literally 15 seconds. Things to leave us with.
Well, if I could just jump in quickly with something that I don't think, because I think the concept of edges and the way that the network kind of articulates that is so generative, and also I think if we think about that geopolitical moment and peripheries and the way they're being securitized and becoming strategic, so much of that is also, I think, around island geographies and coastal geographies with undersea cables, wind farms, and all the kinds of intrigues that are taking place at sea at the moment, where there's shadow tanker fleets and things like that. I do think that Darryn's mentioned water, but I also think sea and coast here is it's one that I think we think about a lot here in Cornwall because we're a narrow and very coastal place. But I think that's fundamentally also reshaping the edges, where the edges are becoming where the action is at, rather than being distant from the action. So I think there's some very cold, hard kind of geography underpinning this putting the geo in the geopolitical, if you like, which I think is quite important to consider in conceptualizing that idea of edge and edges in this discussion, which I found really interesting.
Thanks for that, Harry. I find it really interesting the way that peripheries are constantly changing. So peripheral regions, core regions do not stay the same in any kind of context, but instead are kind of like co-evolving. And also, for me, it's about the relationship between the local and the global. What might feel really, really parochial, really, really far away, actually is part of, or is co-evolving with a whole load of global processes that I find really fascinating. Anybody else?
I can take just very short.
Madeliene.
No, I think it's important also to acknowledge. I think that this militarization is creating a lot of insecurity, and I love this political geographer Simon Dalby. No one knows him. I mean, he's all really been saying the same thing since the 90s or the 80s. He's still going strong, I believe. But I mean, he's very much into that. I mean, who is actually being secured and from what? And in the Swedish context, it's very clear to me that militarization and security discourse is very much intertwined with racism. We have now changed labor and migration laws, making them a lot stricter, which is very much affecting northern Sweden because we need these people. So I find it important to also address that. I mean, who is actually becoming secured and who is not by these new policies. And
okay, thank you very much, everybody. Okay, I think we have run out of time. Well, first of all, I want to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers. So on the behalf of Madeliene and myself, massive thank you to Rainnie, Darryn, Snell and Harry Pitts. And also we should say a huge thank you to the Regional Studies Association team who have managed superbly all of the technical stuff that goes alongside this. So Alex and Nikki, awesome work. Thank you so much. We are the Regional Studies Association EdgeNet Regional Research Network. You'll find our page in the chat. So Nikki's just put it in. Please follow us, subscribe to our mailing list, and there you'll find out about all of the cool stuff that we've got going on. So for those of you that aren't signed up already, we've got a panel at the Regional Studies Association conference in Gothenburg in June. And also we've got a workshop in Lund at the beginning of May. So some stuff happening. So it's been wonderful connecting with you all. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to staying in touch as part of our wider work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanie. Thanks, Madeliene.